So we have also done the cross-mapping between the DCMS Code of Practice, as Jeff mentioned, to the BPGs, but also to the compliance framework. For those who don't know, the DCMS brought out an initial draft March this year. We provided a cross-mapping to that initial draft, but that's now been updated both in relation to the DCMS created a later draft in September, October this year that was based on industry feedback, and we've since then done a further remapping of the version 2 compliance framework across to the latest DCMS Code of Practice. So obviously, given some of the interest around compliance, we're very keen to support that DCMS activity. So let's just quickly go through, for those who've perhaps not seen it or perhaps missed it, let's quickly go through the vulnerability advice. And again, the emphasis in this area is about practicality. Lots of people talk about vulnerability disclosure, but it's another thing to actually put it and implement it into an organisation. And as somebody who's been through this process and had to guide an executive team, it's an awful lot easier if you've got a plan for it before the problem suddenly hits you. So release 1 was released 2 years ago. No significant changes in there. The only major one it's worth pointing out, we have adjusted the licensing so you are free to actually use portions of the document. We'll come on to some of those in a minute. So the usual question. Have you got a process in place? And we'll come on to why, if you haven't at the moment, don't feel alone. But first off, where do you usually end up? We've all seen them. Pick your headline. Brand lover's delight. So clearly this is where companies have been in the position they haven't got the mechanisms in place to deal with vulnerability, and they end up being one of any number of screaming headlines. I don't expect them to stop anytime soon. So one of the activities that's done this summer, the full report came out last week, if you've not seen it, is the Foundation reviewed, as John Moore mentioned in his opening remarks, 331 consumer companies were reviewed for and we stress, a public vulnerability disclosure policy. But then that's really the idea, is that you should be able to contact an organisation if you found a vulnerability. But here's the headline. 90.3% of those companies reviewed didn't have a public disclosure policy. So the good news is, if you're already sat amongst us and you haven't got one, don't feel alone. But the interesting one is by region. And I'm going to freely put my hand up and say this result was a surprise to me as well. So whereas I'd like to think that the Europeans have been very good at setting standards in the past, clearly there's some scope for improvement in this area. So quite interesting that at the moment, at least amongst the respondents or the companies that were reviewed, Asia at the moment leads, which is an interesting result. So the obvious one is, can you respond when you make the headline? So if we actually look at the process in question, one of the first ones, and we talk about it, we've all seen the headline, the researcher did the research, and they tried to contact the company. And that proved to be difficult. Have you got preferably multiple methods of contact? And do you understand how the communications work? Sounds simple, doesn't it? You just email a company and the company responds and says, oh, thank you very much. Well, sadly, it doesn't often work like that. There's an interesting one that's broken in the last week. A northern city council was approached by a researcher over a vulnerability to do with their systems, and the council's response was to immediately report the researcher to the police. Now, to the police's eternal credit, they said this isn't a criminal activity, and they basically referred the council back but it illustrates, yet again, in a timely fashion, communications is something that really does need to be thought through. And it's topical. Resolving conflict. Too often traditional executive boards tend to see researchers contacting organisations as a source of conflict. And that can often get very counterproductive. And I say that as having somebody who's been through this process. But also the importance of speed of response. Heard a great story recently. Pentest Partners did a piece of research, and I think it's true to say that Pentest Partners were very pleasantly surprised when the vendor in question was talking about getting a fix in place in a couple of weeks. That's a great result, but there needs to be more of it. But we also need to acknowledge the work. We'll come on to that a little bit in a minute. But in terms of the actual document, don't expect you to do the eye test, but just to illustrate that you don't have to go and think too hard about some of this. One of the goals of the disclosure policy is we've even provided sample text. You are free to use that. Now, I'm sure in a lot of organisations there may well be that certain element of the legal team who want to go over that, but at least we've given you a starting position. It's all in the document. The obvious one when it comes to method of contacts, again, we cover that in the guide. Typically, obviously, it's email, but again, it's the usual thing of does the email work or does it bounce? So again, there's reminders here about making sure the process is complete. Does it work? And we've covered a little bit around in the guide at high level about the communications, but this is a really important area. One of the things that execs tend to struggle with is, particularly if the research has been carried out by an educational establishment, the kind of traditional corporate response of where's the lawyer and can I take out an injunction, or they've got to sign an NDA because they can't talk about it, as you can imagine, does not fit well with educational establishments. They value their freedom of speech. So that, again, can often be a source of conflict, and it needs to be thought through. And it's an awful lot easier if you've thought these things through before that email drops in your security contact email, and you've now got an exec that's now responding and they're now reactive. It's an awful lot easier to do it proactively. So again, there's guidance in the paper for this. One of the things that, and as I say, I can speak from experience, one of the really key areas here is about de-escalation. And one of the other things is to try and get, particularly inside corporate organisations, is there is an inevitable response when somebody comes along and says, hey, your product's insecure. And like most organisations, we all tend to be on the back foot when we get that kind of information. We tend to be reactive. When in fact, if you try and think about, and there are organisations who do this really well, Google is a good example. Think about it another way. What is that researcher doing if they come to talk to you first and they haven't gone out and they haven't spread that negative message through the press? They're effectively giving you security pen testing for free. Because one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, how much would it cost my organisation to have done the testing that they've done? And I say that, as I say, having been on the end of a piece of penetration testing or a piece of research work which was far more complex than some of the kind of things we've seen today of passwords and all that kind of good stuff, which is just like, well, why would you have a default password? Then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who have such in-depth knowledge of things like Linux operating systems with real corner cases where your own team may not have known about that one. So it's much easier if you get these kind of things thought through ahead of time. And that's really one of the things we're trying to get through with this paper. Speed of response, really important. Because one of the ways that clearly you want to be in a position of is that it's fixed before it becomes public. Much better PR message if you're able to work with that researcher, get the fix out, and actually go out to the market and say, yes, there was a vulnerability, and you also then, particularly from a corporate point of view, this is really, really key with dealing with your customers. It's the way of defending your, ensuring your customers are really confident in you as a vendor. So again, this can be used for competitive advantage. Because for most companies, can you definitely guarantee that your product is completely secure? Well, most companies don't go through common criteria and spend 2 million and wait 2 years for the result. So it's the fact that you're actually demonstrating that you're a quality organisation and that you accept the fact that you haven't provided security perfection, but you've done really good due diligence, and if you are approached, you know how to deal with it. That's a very, very strong message. So again, there's some more words on that in the paper. Acknowledgement. We hear about criminal gangs and people making financial gain, but one of the things you have to remember in the research world is two things. Firstly, why do some of the researchers do it? Is it because they're in some way out to get you? Ironically, no. Quite a lot of researchers are out there because sometimes it can be quite a tough problem to hack. And in fact, you can even be in a situation as somebody who's on the end of that piece of research, you have to ask yourself the question, why are you being researched? It might be because you're actually a leader. It might be that your products are actually quite difficult to hack. Because for most researchers, if it's really that easy, why do they bother? Where's the intellectual challenge? So that's another thing to weave into that. Think through the process. Sometimes actually being on the end of attack might be because actually, as a company, your brand might actually be very good at what it does. So again, you've got to think about, there's the intellectual piece, but there's also that piece for a researcher, which is they're looking for kudos. Particularly in younger researchers, this is about credibility, particularly in the hacking fraternity. So again, another thing to think about in terms of how you respond. Try and turn it into a win-win. That's, in my experience, that's by far one of the best approaches. So use it as a differentiator. We touch on financial gain. You can kind of look at that a number of ways. Certainly, in my experience, some boards find that very difficult. Other boards are more enlightened. I don't know, I can't remember what Google's latest bounty scheme is. But it's, again, we're not saying you should do it, but it may be that it's right for your organisation. So, what are the key takeaways? Well, the first one's fairly obvious. It's probably quite a good idea to implement one in the first place. I can't emphasise this one enough. Executive backing and awareness is essential. And particularly if you are one of those people in the room who is responsible, not necessarily at C-level, for your company's product security, but it's really, really important to keep your exec appraised on team. Because what are C-levels not like? They really don't like surprises. So this is a very, very important area. Make sure somebody's responsible for the communication roles. So again, all part of that customer confidence piece is the customer doesn't want to hear the garbled story. I'm sure a number of you may have seen the recent word with Bloomberg TV and how that piece of reporting went fairly horribly wrong. Bloomberg took the hit on their share price. So it's really important to make sure that you've got that there are roles and responsibilities assigned for people to do the customer communication. And much as I'm very fond of salespeople and I have a number of business development friends, they are not necessarily my chosen people to go and communicate that message. Often because there may be nuances in the message for which you may need somebody with more specialised skills. So that importance of response. With that, I hope you've all found hopefully some key takeaways in there. The main one obviously is to encourage you to use the paper. It's there to be used. And as we were talking about earlier, as Chris mentioned about help, we are here to help you. And we're really keen on feedback. You know, we don't want these documents to become, as it were, large chunks of granite that just get old. That would be a shame.